Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Family History More Than a Story webinar series. This is the second of our events for 2022, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you all this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Nipaluna, Hobart. And Nipaluna is the traditional lands of the Mawinina people. And I'd like to acknowledge their traditional owners, past and present, and all those who continue to care for country today. And perhaps in the chat, you'd like to say hello and tell us where you're coming from this evening too. A couple of housekeeping issues before we get started. First of all, this session is being recorded. And we will let you know of when the recording is available online after the event. If you have a question for our panelists this evening, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat. The chat is for you to introduce yourself and talk amongst yourselves. But if you have a question that you would like the panelists to address, please put it in the Q&A. So the Q&A is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, along with the chat and other functions there. We will try and get to all the questions that are raised in the Q&A, but depending on how our chat goes, we might run out of time to get to them all. So I think that's all the housekeeping issues for now. And so I'd like to welcome you and our speakers this evening, who are going to talk to us about Australian fathering and family history, 1919 to 2019. So our two speakers this evening, Al Thomson and Jill Barnard, and they're going to be in conversation with my colleague, Carla Pascoe-Lay. Unfortunately, Jill is having some technical issues due to a blackout in Melbourne, so she's not actually been able to join us quite yet, but we're hoping that she'll be able to connect through presently. So to introduce our speakers, Al Thomson is Professor of History at Monash University and President of Oral History Australia. Al's had a very long and illustrious career as a historian, and his books include Anzac Memories, The Oral History Reader, 10-Pound Poms with Jim Hamerton, Moving Stories, An Intimate History of Four Women Across Two Countries, Oral History and Photographer with Alexander Freund, and Australian Lives and Intimate History with Anissa Puri. So Al is currently leading a team researching the history of fatherhood in 20th century Australia. And hopefully speaking with him tonight is Jill Barnard. Jill's a PhD candidate at Monash University, and her research focuses on parents' roles in 20th century broken families and the ways in which those parents are remembered. Jill has worked for many years as a consulting historian and has published commission histories and reports on various aspects of Australian history, including life in children's homes and orphanages in the 19th and 20th century. So some of these works include Nursing Mums, A History of the Australian Breastfeeding Association, and Holding On to Hope, A History of the Founding Agencies of the MacKillop Family Services. And Jill and Al are going to be in conversation tonight with my colleague, Carla Pascoe-Lay. So Carla's a lecturer in family history here at the University of Tasmania and joint editor of Studies in Oral History Journal. Carla has recently completed a 6-year study of the history of Australian motherhood as told through oral histories. So I will hand over to Carla now.
Thank you, Kate. Just doing that embarrassing thing of looking for the mute button during the middle of a Zoom. I'm so delighted to be here tonight with all of you, and especially to talk to two of my favourite historians of the family. As we said, with Jill's unfortunately had the very great misfortune to be experiencing a power outage right now, but we're hopeful that she'll be able to join us soon. And as I think it's clear from Kate's introduction, Al and Jill are both really interesting historians in that they've worked across a range of different areas of history. Their work has encompassed obviously academic history, but also professional history, public history, community history, oral history and family history. And so I'd invite you tonight when we get to the Q&A part of the session to think really broadly about the kinds of questions you might want to ask them, drawing upon their wealth of expertise. So Al, I'm obviously really interested in this subject matter. That's why I did a huge study of motherhood. But I'm really curious about the background to this project, this History of Fathering project. Can you tell me where the idea first came from?
Yeah, thanks, Carla, and thanks, Kate, for the introduction as well. Let me just first say that I'm on Wurundjeri country in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, on the other side of Melbourne from Jill, so we've still got power over here. I'm actually in the federal electorate of Cooper, named after that wonderful 20th century Aboriginal activist William Cooper, which stayed Labor on the weekend. And I just want to acknowledge the original Indigenous custodians of this country and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. So thanks for the question, Carla. I guess for me, the project came out of, most directly, it came out of, I'd been doing work about Australian post-war migration, particularly British migrants to Australia, and using lots of letters, diaries, interviews, autobiographical writings and so on. And the voice of women migrants came through more strongly because they were the people who kept the photo albums or who wrote the letters or who kept the letters. And it was much harder to get a sense of fathers in migrant families. And so when I finished that project, I thought, actually, I'd really like to do something about the history of fatherhood in 20th century Australia. I guess it was also, like most of our projects, a bit autobiographical, being a dad and having a dad, and intrigued about fathering. And the project, it's a project that's funded by the Australian Research Council, and there's 6 of us, Jill and myself from Monash, but also our Monash colleagues, Kate Murphy and Johnny Bell, and from Melbourne University, John Murphy and Michael Roper, who's at Essex University in England, but is originally from Melbourne. And we meet online every 2 months to share what we're doing. So that's the background of the project. We're producing a book about Australian fathering from 1919 to 2019. We stop at COVID because things potentially change at that point, but we'll almost certainly have to do an afterword about COVID. And it's a history that's exploring both continuity and change in Australian fathering across that century for different types of families and different types of Australians in different and changing circumstances, both the material circumstances of a sort of economic world and social policy, but also the cultural circumstances of expectations about how families should be and what fathers should be and do.
A grandiose project in the best sense of the word. And I'd say also, I mean, I'm not sure whether you found this in your research, but certainly one of the motivations for me to study motherhood is how strangely neglected these really common and everyday experiences are in the work of historians. But maybe it's partly that we have an assumption that they don't change very much, but it's really interesting why histories of motherhood and fatherhood have been so neglected in the past. Jill, we're so excited that you can join us, and sorry for your internet and electricity woes. Are you hearing us all right?
I'm hearing you fine. I hope you can hear me. Probably lucky you can't see me because I'm in total darkness.
Well, fortunately, we can hear you thanks to the wonders of modern technology. So thank you for persevering, Jill. I wanted
to my son too.
Your son's helped you figure this out tonight, has he?
Yes.
Praise. Well, that's just a great example of the importance of parent-child relationships across many domains. Jill, Al's given us a little bit of a background to the project broadly. Would you like to tell us about how your research, the focus of your research and how it fits within the broader project?
Yes, thank you, Carla. And should I also say that I'm also coming from you in darkness, but from Wurundjeri country tonight, where I live and work. Yes, my part of the project, I'm pursuing a PhD, and I'm using primarily oral history interviews conducted by the National Library of Australia with forgotten Australians about 10 to 12 years ago. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term forgotten Australians, it's a term coined to cover Australian children who were in institutional care or out-of-home care during the 20th century. And I should also point out that not all forgotten Australians like being called Forgotten Australians. They don't necessarily think that title applies to them. But that's all by the by. Listeners may recall that a Senate inquiry in 2004 into children who were in out-of-home care not only termed them Forgotten Australians, but estimated that up to about at least 500,000 Australians experienced that kind of out-of-home care during the 20th century. So it seemed to us as a team, as a fatherhood team, that those stories could provide rich material about family lives in the 20th century in Australia. If there were so many Australian children who were placed in out-of-home care, what does that tell us about their particular family circumstances and the way their parents might have negotiated broader social and economic movements over the 20th century?
Such an important point, Jill, and thank you for reminding us that these terms can be contested as well. The types of language that people choose to describe themselves can be contested, and it's really important to listen to how people wish to be described. One of the things I'm really curious to ask both of you is our attendees will have noticed that we've called this a history of fathering and not fatherhood. And often in popular culture, in news media, and these kinds of places, we tend to default to the term fatherhood. So I'd really like to ask first Al and then Jill, why have you chosen the term fathering to describe your project?
I suppose the first thing to say, Carla, is we borrowed the term from you, an Australian mothering. You were the first person that really made me think about it. And it's an important distinction. It's a subtle one, but I think a really important one. Fatherhood really conjures up expectations of fatherhood. What the manuals tell us, what people tell us about how to be fathers. It's a sort of cultural representation of what fathers should be and do. Whereas the term fathering is a much more active term, and it conjures up the experience of fathering, the nitty-gritty work that you do, whether it's earning an income to raise your kids, or whether it's changing nappies or taking kids out to the beach or whatever. So what we wanted in this project is, yes, we have to write about cultural representations of fatherhood and how that was significant and how that changed across time and influenced what men did as they responded to those expectations. But really what we wanted to focus on was the experience of fathering, and if and how that had changed, and if and how that was different for different types of Australians in different circumstances. So, and personal testimony, whether it's diaries, letters, interviews, autobiographical writing, is a wonderful resource to get inside the experience of fathering and family life, which is really a primary focus of the project and of the book. And it brings it to life, and it also connects it to everyone, because everybody will have had a father. Many of us are fathers or mothers or parents. We're all members of families. So it's a story, the story of Australian fathering. It's a story that speaks to all of us.
And actually, you remind me also, there's a wonderful recent book by American historian Sarah Knott called Mother is a Verb. And in that book, she's very actively asserts that we should understand mothering through the everyday practices of mother. It's not this kind of solid category that's only tied to certain types of identities, that when you actively engage in the practice of caring for a child, you become a mother. Jill, I'm interested in your research. Have you come across sources or perspectives that speak to this distinction between fatherhood and fathering, between our expectations of what a father should be and the actual daily life of fathers?
Yes, I think that you're making a very important point there, Carla, in that in listening to these interviews with Forgotten Australians, I'm listening for both evidence of how their fathers fathered and how their mothers mothered, but also how the narrators in these interviews might assess, in a way, for want of a better word, how their fathers and mothers lived up to their expected roles. So while they may have, each of the narrators may have sort of perspectives on what society expects of a mother and or a father, they also, some of them, not all of them, but some of them do sort of assess their parents and sometimes find them wanting in their parenting, and in their fulfilment of expected roles, gendered roles for mothers and fathers.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting question of where expectations of parents come from, which I think, as you're both suggesting, is a variety of sources. One of the other themes that's coming out in what you're both saying already is the questions of change and continuity. And obviously the research, the project in general and your parts within it cover fairly broad time periods. Maybe Jill, you'd like to reflect first, and then Al, about maybe tell us about the particular time frame of your research, Jill, and about change and continuity over that period.
Yes, thanks, Carla. And of course, my because of the nature of the oral history collection that I'm using, my time span is a little bit shorter than the broader Fathering Project's time span, which is drawing on material from the end of the First World War until a couple of years ago. But the interviews I'm using tend to be focused on from that interwar period, the end of the First World War, but then they tend to, the cohort doesn't reach much beyond the 1960s really, born in the 1960s. There's, I think, one or two interviews in the collection where the narrator was born in the 70s. But of course, they peter out, and there's probably a number of reasons for that. Of course, institutional care for children in those huge institutions we often think about for out-of-home care was rapidly falling out of favour by the 1960s, and other sort of forms of care like fostering and small family group homes were becoming much more popular. And we can speculate that people didn't volunteer for the Forgotten Australians Interviews project because they perhaps didn't regard themselves as being eligible for that kind of project if they had experienced a different sort of care away from their parents. And of course, government policies from the 1970s were much more aimed at trying to preserve family life rather than remove children. So having said that, as a long explanation for why my cohort comes from a much shorter time period than the rest of the project, I think it's there seem to be very clear differences between the family lives and stories of those children who were in care in the interwar period and those who were in care and their family circumstances in the post-Second World War period. I think it's probably not a big surprise to anyone that, you know, in the interwar period, there are a lot more children coming into care simply because of loss of one or other parent through death or desertion, rather than a more complicated sort of nuanced kind of story that seems to emerge in the post-war period.
Thank you, Jill. Al, did you want to reflect about continuity and change over the wider project?
Yeah, sure. It depends who you are. It's different for different Australians. I mean, if you're looking at the recent decades, really the last 25 years, you know, one of the most dramatic changes in Australian families and fathering has been the fact that we now have lots of families with two fathers, or we have families that have no fathers with lesbian couples having kids. So this is something that was pretty well unimaginable in the interwar period. So that's both changing expectations, but also changing medical technologies, IVF, for example, changing the way that people make children and therefore changing the ways that we parent. So that's a really obvious recent change, depending on who you are. I guess the other significant change for particular types of Australians is that the family life of Indigenous Australians changed dramatically since the early 20th century, when most Indigenous Australians were, if you like, under the control of the various Protection Acts, which profoundly shaped and profoundly damaged Aboriginal families, often forced men to move away from their families for work, often remove children from families, undermine the traditional roles of both fathers and mothers, so that in many ways it was really, really hard to maintain Aboriginal families, and it was really, really hard for Aboriginal fathers to maintain contact with their kids. And it's a terrible, painful story, and there are extraordinary accounts of the efforts that Aboriginal men make to stay in touch and be engaged dads. But I guess that's a really significant shift in, I guess, from about in the post-World War II years, but particularly in the 60s and 70s and beyond, that shifts. Although you'd have to say there's still a very nasty stereotype about Aboriginal fathers, that they're absent. Some of you might recall in 2016, Bill Leake, the cartoonist in The Australian, did a really terrible cartoon that was hugely controversial, showing it was connected to the intervention in the Northern Territory, showing an Aboriginal man standing next to a policeman who had this kid in his arm, and the Aboriginal man was drinking a beer, and the policeman says, "Is this your kid?" And he doesn't even know the name of the kid. And it sort of indicated that Aboriginal fathers were disconnected from their kids. It created a furore and a huge social media campaign called @Indigenous Dads, with a whole lot of Indigenous fathers saying, well, actually, that's just a stereotype that no longer holds. Yes, there are serious challenges for Indigenous parenting, but actually there are many responsible, caring Indigenous fathers who work really hard. And one of the things we've discovered in the book is that this movement supporting Indigenous fathers, which really takes off out of really health and education settings in the last 25 years, just trying to support and enable Indigenous men to be able to be the best fathers that they can. So those are two distinctive sets of changes. If you're looking at, if you like, so-called mainstream Australia, I suppose there's actually before that, a third one, post-war migration, brings a whole load of people to Australia, some of whom come from cultures which have different ideas or attitudes or expectations about family life. And so you have fathers with different ideas about what their sons and daughters should be and do. And so that creates issues and tensions in post-war families, particularly between kids that are, if you like, trying to assimilate and be accepted, but they've got parents trying to make them be and do different things. If you're looking at mainstream Australia, or if you like, Anglo-Celtic Australia, the really significant changes, as you know, are in women's lives. I mean, that's revolutionary. If you compare women's lives in 1919 to Australian women's lives in 2019, that's just turned inside out and upside down in terms of women now being workers, having public lives, raising kids, doing et cetera, et cetera. You could argue that there's been a shift in expectations of Australian fathers from, I guess, between the wars, the expectation that their main role was to be the breadwinner, to an expectation now that they should still, earn a wage and support their families, but an expectation that they should also be engaged and active parents. But all the statistics tell us that, whereas women's lives have changed, if you look at who's doing what in the home, it's still primarily women. There are obviously wonderful exceptions, but women still do most of the domestic work and childcare. They do most of the managing of domestic work and childcare. And I guess that all goes back to a lot of things, but one of it, and it's, I suppose, a distinctive feature in Australia, is that the whole notion of the male breadwinner gets set in almost in stone early in the 20th century with the minimum wage. The basic wage in 1907, I think it is, basically sets a basic wage at the wage that a man needs to keep a wife and 3 kids in frugal comfort. And so you get wage inequality immediately set up through that. And then the tax and welfare system connects to that as well. So it basically makes much more sense in families for men to be out at work and women to be at home. And, feminism then spends the next 100 years battling against that to try and break that down. But actually when, for me, the great thing about looking at stories of Australian families is looking at the negotiations in any household about who does what in relation to kids, for example, and what are the material pressures and the cultural expectations that shape that decision-making within families. And it has to be said that the workplace and the way that we work in Australia still profoundly affects what men and women do, and the nature of pay inequality and the limitations of paid parental leave schemes mean that for the most part, most men don't take significant time off with small kids. And if you don't do that, you're probably never going to take a serious and significant role. I'll stop there, Carla.
Oh, well, you know, I'm so interested in these issues, Al, and I'm also thinking while you're talking that they're still so present. We are right now talking, I was listening on ABC radio this morning talking about the problems with childcare for working families. I mean, this is an issue that really hasn't been satisfactorily resolved over 100 years. And I think one of the things that's interesting is with the women's liberation movement, we saw an increasing assertion from women that they wanted to be able to engage in paid work as well as raise children. And a lot of people were very idealistic and optimistic that fathers would step up to fill the gap when women were, you know, returning to the workforce. And instead, largely what we've seen is an expectation that that paid forms of childcare will fill that gap, with fathers not increasing the numbers of hours that they care for children per day very much at all. So it's fascinating. And I think it also speaks to the issue that whenever we study any member of the family, whether it's a mother or a father or a child, we can't do it in isolation from the whole family unit. So, you know, in my work on motherhood, fathers are constantly coming up, as are children, and I'm sure the same in your study. And it's so interesting that even when we're studying something as far back as 100 years ago, it's still so relevant to our lives today. The other thing that I'm thinking as I'm listening to both of you talk is about the distinctiveness of the Australian experience vis-a-vis other countries. Now, I know your focus is on Australia, so I don't expect you to be experts in what's happening in China or Senegal or anywhere else, but I'm curious about two things, I suppose. Whether you think that there's been really distinctive aspects of the history of Australian fathering over the last century. So distinctiveness on the one hand. Second of all, or alternatively, whether you're noticing cultural influences or other influences crossing borders. You know, whether you're noticing Australian fathering being influenced by things happening in other countries. I don't mind. Al, did you want to tackle this question first?
Yeah, okay. I mean, one distinctive feature is the way that the breadwinner notion gets set up really strongly in the early 20th century in Australia, and it takes a long time to begin to break that down. I guess the other distinctive feature is the sort of political and welfare context that shape Aboriginal Australian lives, Indigenous Australian lives, which makes for a distinctive experience. And I guess post-war migration, although that's shared with many other countries as well. In terms of the flow of ideas, I mean, there's no doubt if you look at across, for example, the English-speaking world, that similar patterns of family life are shifting and developing, whether you look at Britain or North America or Australia or New Zealand, with shifts. I mean, governments make a difference when they change legislation about parental leave or equal pay, for example. So there are subtle shifts. I'm not sure. Some people say that there's something distinctive about Australia because of the Australian sort of bush ideal and sort of macho stereotypes. I'm not sure how significant that really is, because I actually think there's not a huge difference when push comes to shove between blokes in Britain and blokes in Australia and blokes in America. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
I think, unfortunately, we've lost Jill again, so there might be a technical difficulty happening there. We've got a few more minutes until we're going to open up to wider questions from the audience, and I'll just remind you all that please do type your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can. Al, let's talk about the distinctiveness of your sources in this project. There's obviously many, many ways that you could study the history of fathering. You've chosen in this project to focus on oral history interviews in particular, and archived oral history interviews rather than doing new ones. And hopefully Jill will be able to hear us now and might be able to jump in first on this question. From both of your perspectives, I'd like you to reflect on how has your choice of source, of using oral history interviews, shaped the kind of history that you can tell here. Jill, would you like to go first?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, Carla, and sorry I dropped out for a while there. I think that the specific collection that I'm using does shape the research findings that I'm able to find. And some people have commented to me that you know, these interviews that I'm using are with people who were you know, apart from their family for at least part, or sometimes for almost the whole of their childhoods. And so in a sense where you know, you've got to be careful that you know, they may not have, that the narrators might not necessarily have really accurate memories of their parents, and that you've got to be conscious that they're often having to fill in the gaps in their own memories of their families with their own official wardship records, which can often paint a fairly devastating picture for those narrators, with, you know, judgments being made about their parents' parenting and insufficient and scant sort of information. But another thing that interests me about these narratives is that they kind of disrupt the notion in a way that we have about forgotten Australians and their lives, and that, you know, the sort of dominant narrative has been that these forgotten Australians were wrenched away from family and lost all contact. And what I'm finding through the interviews is that that's not necessarily the case for a lot of those narrators, that some obviously return to their families having been in institutional care, but there is also a remarkable number of parents of those children, I must say, more particularly mothers I'm finding than fathers, who do manage to maintain contact with their kids even though they're in care, who, you know, a lot of the mothers are particularly tenacious of it, if not regularly visiting as much as they can, fighting to get their kids back and advocating on behalf of their children with authorities in orphanages and things like that. So I think that these oral history interviews bring a really different kind of angle for looking at both parenting in these kinds of families, but also that narrative of Australian children who were in institutional care.
Such an important point, Jill, and I think historians of child welfare have reminded us that the archival records created by institutions designed to care for children are very much created from the perspective of the people with power and control over those situations, rather than the people who were kind of participants with less power within that. Al, would you like to reflect on how oral history makes this project distinctive and how it shaped your findings?
I just respond to your last point, Carla, that, you know, the abiding and I guess the pioneering and abiding commitment of oral history was to record the stories of people whose lives aren't in the records, and to fill those gaps and to transform history as a result. I should add, I mean, the project isn't only using oral history. So Johnny and Kate have been doing wonderful work using material from the Royal Commission of Human Rights in the 1970s, looking at family life then. So we're using other sources as well. But I guess the interesting thing about oral history, there are thousands of oral history interviews sitting in archives around Australia not being used. We always think we have to create new interviews, but there's just extraordinary riches in the state and national archives, but also in local collections. And increasingly they're accessible because they've been digitised, because finding aids are improving, and you can often access them online. So for anyone doing the history of the family, it's an extraordinarily rich resource. So for this project, as well as the Forgotten Australians interviews that Jill's talked about, just from the National Library itself, we're using, for example, some interviews, 600 interviews done for the Bicentenary Project in the late 1970s, called Australia 1938, interviews about Australian life between the wars. And every one of those interviews talks about family life in great detail. we're using the Australian Generations interviews, 300 interviews conducted with Australians born between 1930 and 1980. Again, really rich on family life. And then alongside Forgotten Australians, they're bringing them home interviews with members of the stolen generations. Again, another really rich collection. And you could find equivalent collections in all of the state libraries. In terms of their value, I mean, for me, the value of that material, it's a bit like what Jill was saying. It gets you down to the nitty-gritty of what's happening in someone's life as they remember it, and the complex range of circumstances and factors that shape the decisions that we make, or sometimes the decisions that we can't make, and shape the course of individual and family life. And often we can see patterns that highlight themes and help us understand change across time as well as continuity. But also we can see idiosyncrasies and why particular circumstances or particular character makes for different outcomes. I mean, let me just give you one example from the Australian 1938 interviews of an extraordinary interview that actually is atypical. It's a man who kept his kids when all the odds were against him. It was an interview done in 1979 by Louise Douglas with a man called Arthur Mandel, who grew up in Sydney, born in 1901, and one of 4 sons. His father was a house painter, working class man. His mother died in 1910 when Arthur was 9. And we know that in most families, in those circumstances, when the mother died or disappeared, usually died, fathers either were encouraged to remarry so there'd be someone else who could look after the kids, or they found relatives, farmed the kids out to relatives, or the kids went into care. And that's what a lot of Jill's material from Forgotten Australians is like. So the Australian 1938 interviews show you fathers who kept their kids. So Arthur Mandel's father, he moved house to a street where an aunt lived, and the aunt was able to care for the infant who was not yet at school. The 3 younger boys were in primary school, and Arthur's dad learnt to cook, and the boys all learnt to do housework, and they would wait at the front gate for him when he came home from work every day. And it's an extraordinary story. And Arthur recalls this man in the 1910s and 20s raising a family of 4 boys and managing to keep them. And the really extraordinary thing about this story is that when Arthur himself becomes a father of 2 daughters in the 1930s, his account of being a father is so different from almost any other account of men of those times, in that he was an extraordinarily engaged and active father. He was feeding the kids with a bottle. He was washing nappies. He was determined to be there in his kids' life. And in so many ways, that was shaped by the fact that that was the type of fathering that he'd grown up with. He'd had an active and engaged father. So I guess one of the themes that comes out of the project and that you can see in these interviews is how the way that we parent is profoundly shaped, for better or worse, by how we've been parented, the lessons we've learned, as well as the circumstances that we have to live with. And I guess, Arthur Mandel's story, you can listen to it. It's available online in the National Library. And you can hear his voice, and you can get the emotion of that experience. You get, he talks about the puddings that his father learned to make for his 4 sons. It's just not what you expect of a man in the 1920s. You get a sense of his father sitting down and talking with the boys about their day. It's in some ways, it could be the 2020s, but it's the 1920s. And it just shows that sometimes personal character can overcome extraordinarily difficult circumstances, but it also just highlights the richness of this material.
And I think we often have a lot of our students from the Family History Diploma in the audience for these webinars. And I think for our students, it's part of the reason that we include oral history as one of the subjects, because we do a lot of really powerful work with archival documents as family historians. But there's certain things that are almost impossible to find out about outside of an interview context. And I'm thinking particularly of people's private lives and the personal details of their lives, but also the everyday, the things that were considered too normal to bother documenting anywhere, like the kinds of nappies and that parents might have used in the 1950s, just considered every day, but fascinating to us now. I think there's a lot of there's a lot of power. And I think you're also suggesting, Al, that when you can, particularly when you can hear a person's voice, you can hear a lot of emotion coming through as well, even when they don't use emotional language in their memories. Really, really interesting. So some of you might now be inspired to go off and listen to some of the interview collections that Al and Jill have been talking about. As Al said, many of them are available online, particularly if you go to the National Library of Australia website, you'll see, and look for oral history, they've listed many of their major collections there, and you can follow up if you're interested in learning more. We've got some really wonderful questions coming in the question and answer, so I really want to make sure we have time to get to those. Those of you that have questions you haven't had a chance to pop in the Q&A yet, please put them in. I'm going to start with this interesting question from Julie Simpson. She asks, with regard to the Aboriginal population, did the discussion touch at all on the fathering done by the broader family, such as uncles and elders who play a large part in the fathering role? So I guess it's thinking about fathering more expansively than just a biological father. Would you like to answer that one, Al?
Yeah, look, that's a wonderful question. I'm sorry I didn't have time to talk about that. The other thing that becomes really clear when you do Aboriginal family history is that Aboriginal families do families different. Extended family relationships and support are absolutely critical. And, you know, one of the reasons many Aboriginal families survived and sustained across tough times is because a lot of different people were involved in caring for kids, you know, whether mothers and aunties, but also uncles. And so one of the really interesting things in the sort of contemporary Aboriginal fathering movement is an encouragement for Aboriginal men, not just to raise their own kids, but also to be uncles for other Aboriginal kids and to continue that distinctive Aboriginal way of parenting, which actually has a lesson for the rest of us, really, about how extended family and kin or significant others can also be part of a sense of what a family might be and who can help raise kids and make it easier and take the pressures off struggling parents.
Well, it reminds me also, there's a very rich concept that the feminist Patricia Hill Collins uses of other mothering. And she talks about how in African American communities, it's not just the biological mother who cares for children. And maybe we could extend that to other fathering or other parenting to think about those roles more broadly. I've got a question from Nicolette Snowden. This might be a good one for you, Jill. She says, I'm curious about the topic of blame between parents and children, and if or how this was described by interviewees. And does an emotional account of blame change over time? I think you alluded to this earlier, Jill.
Yes, thanks for that question, Nicolette. Yes, and I'm using the word blame in a very broad sense. You know, some of the narrators quite clearly do blame a father or a mother for their circumstances, and say, you know, literally, well, my father was an alcoholic and a violent man, and he was his actions that broke our family up. But others, sometimes I'm discerning that kind of blame by the way that narrators are describing their mother's or father's kind of action. And sometimes that's their own perception. And as Nicolette sort of suggested, sometimes you find over the course of an interview, and some of these interviews are very, very long, you know, they're several hours. And over the course of the interview and looking back and reflecting on their parents and their own life course, you will find that sometimes the narrators will shift a little bit and move from the perspective of, well, it all happened because my father deserted us, to maybe a little bit more understanding of what might have happened to their parents.
That's a really interesting point, Jill. Yeah, about so how our evaluations of parenting can change over time, which has also come up in my interviews with mothers, with some women saying, I didn't fully appreciate my mother's position and what she'd sacrificed for me until I became a mother myself. It's an interesting question.
Yes. and I find, you know, this is not across the board, but I do find that women narrators, particularly if they've become mothers themselves, are more sympathetic to their own mothers than often male narrators might be. And also you can see differences in generations too. Like domestic violence seems to figure in quite a few stories, but it tends to be female narrators who will place it at the forefront of what went wrong more than males will.
And speaks to change and continuity as well, doesn't it? Our willingness to talk about these things. There's an interesting question here that I think you might both want to answer. Judith Meehan asks, did you explore or find that boys that had experienced out-of-home care faced any greater challenges when fathering? So I suppose the question is, what is the influence of a childhood in out-of-home care upon experiences of fathering? Jill, would you like to go first on this one?
I think that's an interesting question that I'm really wanting to explore a bit more as I go further, because some of the narrators, particularly the ones from a much earlier generation, will quite legitimately talk about what a horrible time they had in care, how they were physically punished and perhaps abused, etc. But then they go on, from how they describe their own parenting, they seem to have been quite tough on their own children themselves, and quite prepared to be a very authoritarian father and to use corporal punishment when it was needed. But others, Al talked about the Arthur Mendel example of a father influencing his son's parenting. But I've also found that sometimes it's not the male narrator's own father who sets an example, but examples from within the institutions and or a foster father that might have an influence or be a kind of a role model in often a very positive way to the narrators as they then go on to parent.
Such an interesting point, Jill. Actually, it leads us on really nicely to two other questions we've got in the Q&A. I might put them together and then invite Al to respond. It's about different types of fathers and changing modes of fathering. So Nyanki van der Tot asked, are we looking at the role of stepfathers in fathering? And Rena Henderson said, do you anticipate differences in your research about fathering in families with two male parents and perhaps those with double mothers? So this question of both of gay fathers and of stepfathers, and I suppose how you're defining fatherhood, what's the scope of your research, Al?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I mean, we've been writing some of the more recent decades, and this is just very much part of it. Blended families, we live in extraordinarily complex and varied family formations in Australia today. And certainly, one of the really interesting things of looking at families where there are two men as fathers, maybe a gay couple raising kids that they've adopted, that's really interesting because the sort of gender expectations about men or women aren't necessarily there, but they're still negotiating and managing who does what, but not with the sort of overlay of a cultural expectation about what's appropriate for men or women. So that's a really interesting and significant difference. And I guess for example, lesbian couples that are raising their own children, but there may be fathers involved, then there are so many different ways those fathers can be involved, either not at all or very actively. So again, that's very different. Stepfathers are, they're throughout the century, particularly, I mean, the first half of the 20th century, they're often in situations where parents have died and mothers have remarried. In the last half of the century, it's more often family breakdown and divorce. But, kids are often being raised by parents, men who aren't their biological fathers. And yeah, you get all those sort of cultural ideas about the stepfather or the stepmother, but you also get, stepfathers who really put it in and try really hard to do their very best with kids that they didn't bear, if you like, but who they've got a responsibility for. tracking that off across time, but also tracking the way society thinks about that. And the statistics about domestic violence and the ways in which often certain types of fathers get blamed. That's part of the story. Yeah.
Got an interesting question here from Sonia Jennings. She asks, how much does popular culture influence our views on fathering? I'm thinking of TV, sitcoms and the like. And to that we might add movies, books, other sort of cultural representations that might influence our ideas about what fathers are and perhaps what a good father looks like. Jill, did this come up in any of the interviews that you consulted? Did anyone talk about books or films or other things influencing their ideas about fathers?
Not that I can remember, Carla. I think it's more the as Al explained much earlier. There is a lot more around that. The influence in Australia of the very strong breadwinner father, stay-at-home mother kind of stereotype that seems to come across in narrators' images of what makes a good mother and father. But I can't think of any examples where they're kind of referring to a popular culture kind of model.
Any examples from your research, Al?
That's a good question. I did an interview yesterday with ABC Radio Tasmania, and they reminded me that Bluey, of course, anyone who's got small kids at the moment will know that Bluey is an extraordinary role model for fathering. A whole generation of small kids are going to grow up thinking that dads can be really active, engaged parents. So yeah, the representations about what fathers should be and do are significant and have been significant, and they've shifted across time from the sort of blokes are breadwinners to blokes can earn a living, but they can also care for kids. I guess the really interesting thing is, how do people live with those representations? How do you, as a first-time father, how do you decide what type of father you're going to be? But also, you might want to be this type of father, but if your job requires you to work 12-hour days and you're absolutely shattered and so on and so forth, there are real tensions between what's sort of physically and materially possible and the sort of ways in which economics shape family life. And representations and expectations. And so for me, that's the really intriguing thing that you can discover when you drill down and look closely at any family. And who does what is shaped by expectations, but also by structural and material factors.
I'm conscious we've probably only got time for one last question, and there's still so many good questions in the chat. I did want to say quickly that who was it? Someone was asking about oral history, and I just wanted to put a shout out for Oral History Australia and Oral History Victoria that run training sessions. If you're interested in learning more about how you can do your own oral history interviews, there's also great resources on the Oral History Australia website. There's a couple of questions about other family members. So Prudence Holling has asked, how are older children playing that parental role considered? That wasn't uncommon in large families when older children would help with parenting younger children. I've also been thinking about grandfathers while you've been talking, in the role of grandfathers. Did that come out in any of your interviews that you've consulted, Jill?
It's an interesting question. The extended family and help from the extended family just isn't there, and often it's explained in terms of, particularly in the interwar years, that extended family couldn't afford to help out with children or to take the children when mother dies or something like that. But a couple of the post-war families, there is interference from a mother-in-law, perhaps intervening because she perceives her daughter-in-law as not being an adequate mother, etc. And, you know, having a role in having the children placed into state care. But with older siblings, that's a really good point. A number of the narrators who were older sisters, while they weren't necessarily, they had played a part within the family in looking after their younger siblings, and that sort of sense of responsibility did often seem to be maintained when they were institutionalised, and even later, that they fretted about and worried about their siblings, and if they were in the same institution as them, went out of their way to try and look after their siblings.
Thank you, Jill. Al, I reckon we've got 1 or maybe 2 minutes if you'd like to answer that final question or make any other concluding remarks.
I'll look at grandparents, extended family, siblings, older siblings. They all pop up all the time in interviews, either because of their absence, but often because of their significant presence. I mean, the number of older kids, particularly daughters, who play a really significant role in parenting is true across the century for a whole range of circumstances and reasons. Absolutely.
Well, I'm gonna draw us to a close at this point, and I'm going to hand us back over to our wonderful chair, Kate Bagnall.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you so much to Al and Jill for such a wonderful and enriching discussion this evening. And I think particularly thanks to Jill for sitting in the dark while she did it. I think that scores you bonus points. Before we go this evening, I've just got 2 more things that I'd like to let you know about. The first is a reminder for those of you who might be interested in studying family history with us. Our next intake into the Diploma of Family History at UTAS is in term 3, which starts on the 25th of July. So we have an introduction to family history unit that's starting then. So that's a really great place to start your studies with us if you're interested. And the second thing is that our next webinar in this series will be on the 24th of August. So again, a Wednesday evening at 6 o'clock. And our next webinar will be Naomi Parry in conversation with Dr. Frank Golding of Federation University and Dr. Kate O'Neill, who's the National Editor of the Find and Connect web resource at the University of Melbourne. And Frank and Kate are going to be discussing their research into the multi-generational experiences of childhoods that have been disrupted or disordered by state intervention. And they'll also explain why care leavers are so keen to understand their own family histories. So I hope you will be able to join us then. And once again, a big thanks to Carla and Al and Jill for this evening's webinar.